There's a photograph that was never supposed to survive. It was taken in the winter of 1927, deep in the hills of eastern Tennessee. On a porch step, a girl sits alone. Her dress is clean and her hair is combed, but her eyes don't look like they belong to anything human. They are too wide, set too far apart. The pupils don't track together. And if you stare at that photograph long enough, you begin to feel she's looking through you, not at you. For 60 years, the family who kept that photo locked it in a trunk. They didn't speak her name. They didn't mark her grave. And when a historian finally found the image in 1989, tucked between mold Bible pages, the only thing written on the back was a single word: forgive us. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Her name was Violet Mae Cotter, though almost no one alive today knows that. She was born on November 14, 1911, in a valley so remote it didn't appear on state maps until 1936. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride by mule. The nearest church was burned down before she turned 3. And the nearest law enforcement, they didn't come up that mountain unless someone was already dead. The Cotters, Violet's family, had lived in that valley for 5 generations. They didn't leave. They didn't marry outsiders. They didn't trust anyone whose blood wasn't already tangled up in their own. By the time Violet was born, the family tree had stopped branching. It had folded in on itself like a knot that couldn't be undone. Her father, Ezra Cotter, was her second cousin. Her mother, Ida, was Ezra's niece by blood and his sister-in-law by marriage. If you tried to map their ancestry, you'd find the same 6 names repeating over and over, looping back like a prayer or a curse. Violet wasn't the first child born into that tangle, but she was the one they couldn't hide. She was the one whose body refused to cooperate with the lies they told themselves. And she was the one whose existence would eventually force the outside world to ask a question no one in that valley wanted to answer. How long can a bloodline survive when it has nowhere else to go? The midwife who delivered Violet left the cabin before sunrise and never came back. Years later, when a county nurse finally tracked her down in a neighboring state, the woman would only say this: "That baby didn't cry right." And when I looked at her face, I knew God wasn't in that room. What Violet was born with, modern geneticists would recognize immediately as severe craniofacial abnormalities, the result of multiple generations of consanguineous breeding. Her skull was misshapen, elongated at the back and flattened across the brow. Her eyes sat too far apart, a condition called hypotelorism, and they didn't move in sync. One would track left while the other drifted upward, giving her a gaze that seemed to look into 2 worlds at once. Her nose was barely formed, just a small ridge of cartilage with narrow slits for nostrils. And her jaw didn't close properly. It hung slack, revealing gums with too few teeth spaced too far apart. But it was her eyes that people remembered. Not because of how they looked, but because of what happened when she stared at you. Neighbors who saw her as a child said it felt like being seen by something that shouldn't exist, like standing in front of a mirror that showed you a version of yourself you didn't recognize. Most days, Violet's mother kept her inside. She dressed her in long sleeves even in summer. She taught her to sit still, to keep quiet, to avoid the windows when voices passed by on the road. The family told outsiders she was sickly, fragile, that the mountain air didn't agree with her. But the truth was simpler and far more shameful. They were hiding what they had made. By the time Violet turned 7, the damage went far deeper than her face. She couldn't speak in full sentences. Her palate was too malformed, her tongue too thick and uncoordinated. The sounds she made were wet and guttural, more animal than human. She couldn't walk without stumbling. Her legs bowed inward, her knees knocking together with each step, a result of skeletal deformities that would have been corrected with basic medical intervention anywhere else. But there was no intervention. No doctor ever examined her. No teacher ever sat her down with a book. She existed in the gaps of society, in the space between what was acknowledged and what was buried. Her mind, though, was the cruelest part. Because Violet understood, you could see it in the way she watched people. The way she reached for her mother when voices rose in anger, The way she flinched when her father drank too much and started talking about bloodlines and God's will and the purity of the family name. She knew she was different. She knew she was wrong, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. The other children in the valley didn't play with her. They threw rocks at her shadow when she appeared at the edge of the yard. They called her the Hollow Girl because they said if you looked into her eyes long enough, you'd see nothing inside. Just empty space where a soul should be. Their parents didn't correct them. In fact, some of the adults believed it, too. There was a superstition in those mountains that when a family's blood ran too close for too long, the devil could slip in through the cracks. That children born from that union weren't fully human anymore, that there was something else, something in between, and Violet, with her broken face and her unblinking stare, seemed to prove it. The winter Violet turned 12, her mother died giving birth to a stillborn boy. The child came out blue and twisted, its spine curved like a question mark, its fingers fused together in a way that made them look more like flippers than hands. They buried both of them in unmarked graves behind the house next to 3 other siblings who hadn't survived past infancy. After that, Violet's father stopped speaking. He would sit on the porch for hours, staring at nothing, a rifle across his lap. He aged 20 years in 6 months. His hair went white and his hands shook. And when he looked at Violet, there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not anger, not shame, but something worse. Guilt, raw and infected, and eating him alive. He started drinking corn liquor every night, mumbling to himself about sins of the father and blood debts that couldn't be paid. One night, drunk and incoherent, he told Violet's older brother, a boy named Caleb who was himself mentally delayed and partially deaf, that the family had been cursed 3 generations back, that their great-grandfather had married his own daughter after his wife died in childbirth, and that every child born since then carried the weight of that original sin. Whether it was true or just the ramblings of a man whose mind had shattered under guilt, no one could say. But the stories spread, and in a community that small, stories became truth faster than facts ever could. By 1924, the Cotter family was completely isolated. No one would trade with them. No one would visit. When Ezra went into town for supplies, shopkeepers wouldn't look him in the eye. They'd set his goods on the counter and walk into the back room until he left. The family had become a living ghost story. A warning, an example of what happened when people forgot that some boundaries existed for a reason. Violet was 16 years old when the state finally came. It wasn't out of compassion. It was because a traveling preacher had passed through the valley in the spring of 1927 and seen her sitting on the porch. He'd spoken to a few of the neighbors, heard the whispers, seen the way people crossed to the other side of the road when they walked past the Cotter property. And when he returned to Knoxville, he wrote a letter to the Tennessee Board of Health describing what he called a crime against nature hiding in the mountains. 2 men arrived in a black Ford on a Tuesday morning in October. They wore suits and carried leather folders and spoke with the kind of calm authority that made resistance feel pointless. They didn't ask permission. They walked into the house, looked at Violet sitting in the corner with her hands folded in her lap, and told Ezra she was being removed for her own welfare. Ezra didn't fight. He just nodded and signed the papers they put in front of him. And when they led Violet out to the car, he didn't say goodbye. He didn't even look at her. He stood on the porch with his head down and his shoulders shaking. And the last thing Violet heard as the car pulled away was the sound of her father weeping. They took her to the East Tennessee Hospital for the Insane, a sprawling brick facility outside Knoxville that housed over 2,000 patients. She was classified as a mental defective, a term used at the time for anyone whose physical or cognitive impairments made them unfit for society. She was given a bed in a locked ward, a cotton dress with no buttons, a number instead of a name. And for the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who looked like her, broken people, forgotten people, people whose families had decided they were easier to erase than to explain. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Violet lived in that hospital for 31 years. She never had another visitor. Her father died in 1929 alone in the cabin from what the county coroner listed as complications of chronic alcoholism. Her brother Caleb disappeared sometime in the early 30s. Some say he wandered off into the woods and never came back. Others say he drowned himself in the river. The cabin rotted into the ground. The land was reclaimed by the state for unpaid taxes, and the Cotter name faded from memory like smoke. Inside the hospital, Violet became known as a quiet patient. She didn't scream like some of the others. She didn't fight the attendants or tear at her own skin. She simply existed. She sat by the window in the dayroom, watching the trees beyond the fence, her mismatched eyes tracking birds that no one else seemed to notice. The nurses said she hummed sometimes, low tuneless sounds that felt older than language. One attendant, a woman named Ruth Calloway, later wrote in her private journal that Violet had a strange habit. Every evening at dusk, she would press her hand flat against the window glass and mouth words that no one could understand. Ruth tried for months to decipher it, and one day she finally realized what Violet was saying. Over and over, she was saying home, a place that no longer existed. In 1958, Violet developed pneumonia. She was 46 years old, though she looked 70. Her body had deteriorated under years of institutional neglect, poor diet, no exercise, and no sunlight. When she died on a February morning, there was no funeral, no obituary, no record beyond a single line in the hospital log, patient 1447. Deceased, no known family. They buried her in the hospital cemetery in an unmarked plot alongside hundreds of others who had been forgotten by the world. The photograph surfaced 61 years later. A researcher named Dr. Ellen Marsh was combing through estate sales in eastern Tennessee, looking for documentation related to early 20th century psychiatric institutions. She found a steamer trunk in a barn outside Gatlinburg filled with water-damaged Bibles, old letters, and a single leather-bound photo album. Most of the images were ruined, but one had survived. A girl on a porch, eyes that didn't align, a face that didn't fit, and on the back in faded pencil, "Forgive us." Dr. Marsh spent 2 years tracing the image. She cross-referenced hospital records, census data, and land deeds. She interviewed descendants of families who had lived in that valley, though most refused to speak on record. One elderly woman, a distant cousin of the Cotters, finally broke her silence. She said the family had been taught never to mention Violet, that her existence was a stain they had spent generations trying to wash away, that even now in the year 2000, there were people in those mountains who believed talking about her would bring the curse back. Dr. Marsh published her findings in a small academic journal. The article was titled Genetic Isolation and Its Human Cost, a case study from rural Appalachia. It included the photograph, and for the first time, people outside that valley saw Violet's face. The response was immediate and uncomfortable. Some readers were horrified. Others were angry that the family had been allowed to continue for so long without intervention. But a few saw something else. They saw a girl who had been punished for the sins of people she never chose. A girl who had spent her entire life being hidden, blamed, and erased. A girl who deserved to be remembered not as a cautionary tale or a monster, but as a human being who suffered because no one had the courage to stop what was happening. Today, there's a small movement among genealogists and historians to locate Violet's grave and give her a proper headstone. It hasn't happened yet. The hospital cemetery is overgrown now. The plot's long lost to time and weather. But her photograph still exists. And if you look at it long enough, past the horror and the pity, you can see something else. You can see a girl who wanted to go home, who hummed to herself in the quiet moments, who pressed her hand to the glass and hoped someone someday would remember her name. Violet Mae Cotter, born 1911, died 1958. Forgotten by her family, buried by the state.